a sugar plantation pressed hard against the Mississippi River, there lived an enslaved boy who never spoke, not when he was ordered, not when he was mocked, not even when his name was laughed out of him and replaced with something cruel. They said he was empty-headed. They said silence meant nothing lived behind his eyes. But every night, while the fields slept and the river whispered against the shore, the boy listened. He counted footsteps. He measured voices. He memorized habits. And then, on one storm, dark morning, his place was empty. No struggle, no blood, no sound. Only the sudden, terrifying question left behind on that plantation. How long had the quiet boy been planning to leave, while everyone else was busy laughing? In the year 1847, the sugar plantations of southern Louisiana breathed in rhythm with the Mississippi River. The days began before light and ended long after the sun had fallen behind the cane fields. Bells rang, boots struck packed earth, and names were called, sometimes gently, often sharp as a whip's crack. Names mattered on the plantation. They were how orders were given, how blame was assigned, how a person was counted. The boy arrived without one. He came on a flat, bottomed river boat just after dawn, when the mist still clung to the water like a thin white cloth. He was small for his age. No one knew exactly how old, perhaps 10 or 11, and carried nothing but the shirt on his back. His feet were bare, hardened by travel. His eyes were dark and watchful, moving slowly from sound to sound, face to face like someone learning a new language without being taught. When the overseer asked his name, the boy did not answer. The question was repeated, louder this time. Still nothing. A hand snapped its fingers inches from the boy's face. No flinch. No reply. Someone laughed. Someone else shook their head and said, "Must be simple." That word settled quickly, like dust, and stuck. The overseer did not wait long. He rarely did. A pause too long was considered defiance, and defiance was dangerous. But the boy's silence was different. It was not stubborn, not bold. It was empty of challenge. The overseer frowned, as if annoyed by a tool that refused to work. "Quiet one," he muttered, then louder for others to hear. "We'll call him Mute." The name was not given with ceremony. It was tossed, careless and mocking, and it landed where it pleased. The other enslaved people did not repeat it aloud at first. Names given that way carried weight, but by evening, whispers had spread. The silent boy, the one who doesn't speak. He was assigned to lighter work at first, not out of kindness, but caution. Those believed to be slow were often watched closely. He carried water, swept paths, gathered dropped cane. He followed instructions perfectly, though none could recall hearing him acknowledge a single command. He watched hands, learned gestures, memorized patterns. At night, he slept on a thin pallet near the others. The quarters were crowded, thick with the sounds of coughing, murmured prayers, and exhausted breathing. Someone asked him quietly where he was from. He did not answer. An older man, worn thin by years in the fields, leaned closer and said, not unkindly, "Boy, you got a tongue same as the rest of us." The boy looked at him then, not blankly, not confused. He held the man's gaze just long enough to make him uncomfortable, then lowered his eyes again. Silence returned. That was when people began to notice something else. The boy did not stare at the ground as many children did. He looked outward, at doors, at paths, at the bend of the river beyond the cane. His eyes lingered on the bell tower longer than necessary. He noticed who carried keys. He noticed which men counted supplies and which only pretended to. Still silence. Children mocked him first. They always did. They waved hands in front of his face, made loud noises near his ears, called him broken. When he did not react, they grew bored and cruel in quieter ways, taking his place in line, hiding his water cup. He never protested. He simply adjusted. Adults were less amused. Silence unsettled them. A person who did not speak could not be measured easily. Words revealed fear, ignorance, hope. Silence revealed nothing. The overseer tested him once, late in the afternoon, when heat pressed hard against the skin. He gave the boy an order and waited. When the boy moved to carry it out without reply, the overseer snapped, "Did you hear me?" The boy paused, turned slowly, and nodded once. That nod, small as it was, irritated the overseer more than defiance might have. It suggested understanding, awareness, choice. That night, the boy was given a number to sleep beside and a ration like the others. Nothing more, nothing less, but he remained without a true name. Names, after all, were spoken, and this boy did not speak. Among the enslaved, quiet theories began to form. Some said the boy had been beaten into silence before arriving. Others whispered he was touched by sorrow so deep it sealed his mouth. One woman, who had buried 3 children, watched him carefully and said nothing at all. The boy, meanwhile, learned the plantation the way others learned scripture. Slowly, patiently, with attention to detail, he learned which boards creaked at night, which lanterns were left burning, which dogs barked without biting. He learned that silence could move through places, sound could not. By the end of his first week, everyone knew him, and no one knew him at all. He lay awake that final night of the week, listening to the river swell against its banks. The world around him slept, confident in its understanding of who he was. They believed silence meant emptiness. They were wrong. By the second week of the boy's presence on the plantation, his silence was no longer a curiosity. It had settled into something smaller and more dangerous: habit. On plantations, habits ruled everything. The bell rang, the hands moved. The sun rose, the work began. Even cruelty followed a rhythm. Once the novelty of the boy's quiet faded, people stopped questioning it. They began using it. Children were the first to make a sport of him. They gathered near the water barrels, where he often worked, whispering to one another before stepping into his path. One would clap loudly behind him. Another would shout a name that was not his. A third would bend close and his questions into his ear. "Can you hear? Can you speak?" Then laugh when he did not respond. At first, the boy startled easily. His shoulders tensed. His hands paused in mid-motion, but he did not cry out. He did not plead. He did not explain himself. Within days, even the smallest flinch disappeared. He learned to keep his body still, his face smooth, his eyes lowered just enough to avoid challenge, but not enough to seem unaware. The children grew frustrated. Mockery thrives on reaction. Without it, cruelty loses its reward. So they changed tactics. They hid his cup, took his place in line, gave him the worst corner to sleep in. Each small act was meant to provoke a sound, a protest, a crack in the silence. Noon came, adults noticed too. Some laughed openly, calling him half-made or empty as a gourd. Others spoke around him as if he were not present at all. That, perhaps, was the cruelest part. Not the words themselves, but the certainty with which they were spoken. Men discussed punishments, sales, and debts while the boy stood close enough to hear every word, never bothering to lower their voices. "He don't know what we're saying," one said once, tossing a glance at the boy. "Even if he did," another replied, "what's he going to do about it?" The overseer encouraged the mockery, without ever issuing a command. He allowed laughter to linger longer than usual. He assigned the boy tasks that placed him at the center of foot traffic, where more eyes could find him. When someone asked whether the boy might be deaf rather than slow, the overseer shrugged. "Silence suits him," he said. "Less trouble." That sentence followed the boy wherever he went. Silence suits him. It meant he was given orders without explanation. Mistakes were assumed before they were made. Praise was unnecessary. After all, a silent boy could not thank anyone. He could not tell tales. He could not complain. Or so they believed. The boy learned quickly what mockery revealed. Laughter showed where people felt safe. Cruel jokes were made only where consequences were unlikely. He noticed which men mocked openly and which waited until authority was near. He noticed how the tone of voices changed. When the overseer passed, how eyes dropped, how spines straightened. Mockery, he realized, was not random. It followed power. One afternoon, an older enslaved man stumbled under a heavy load and was scolded sharply. The boy stood nearby, holding a bucket. The man muttered something under his breath, and the overseer raised his hand in warning. The boy watched carefully, not the raised hand, but the overseer's feet, the way he shifted his weight before speaking, the pause he allowed before deciding whether anger was worth the effort. That night, when laughter echoed faintly in the quarters at the boy's expense, the older man did not join in. He watched the boy instead, long and searching, as if trying to read something written too small for most eyes. Quiet don't mean blind, the man said softly, more to himself than anyone else. The women were different. Some avoided the boy altogether, as if silence were catching. Others offered small kindnesses without words, an extra scrap of cloth, a place nearer the fire, a gesture to sit. They did not ask questions. They did not push. They understood that some things, once broken, did not announce themselves. One woman, older than most, with hands twisted by years of labor, watched how the children mocked him. One evening, she snapped sharply at them to leave him be. The children scattered, surprised. "He ain't your plaything," she said. The boy met her eyes then, just briefly, and inclined his head. No smile, no sound. But something passed between them that required neither. By now, the name given to him, mute, was spoken freely. It was called across yards and fields. It was used in jokes, in commands, in warnings. It stripped him of whatever past he had carried with him. A person without a name could not easily be remembered, could not be missed, and that, too, the boy understood. Mockery dulled attention. People stopped watching closely those they believed beneath notice. Eyes slid past him. Conversations continued when he entered a room. Doors were left ajar. Words were spoken too freely. Silence made him invisible. As days passed, the boy's movements grew more confident. He knew when to arrive and when to leave. He learned which laughter was harmless and which masked fear. He learned that those who mocked loudest often listened least. At night, lying still on his pallet, he replayed the day not in sounds, but in patterns. Who stood where? Who spoke when? Who looked away? They believed they were shaping him with their cruelty. In truth, they were sharpening him, and by the time mockery became routine, expected, unexamined, dull, the boy had already learned the most important lesson of all. A world that laughs at silence never hears it moving. By the end of the third week on the plantation, it had become clear to everyone that the boy's silence was not simply absence of speech. It was presence of something else entirely. While the children and some of the younger enslaved workers mocked him, and even the overseer dismissed him as slow or empty, the boy's eyes never wandered aimlessly. They took in the world with the patience of someone who knew every detail mattered. He moved among the cane fields with his bucket, carrying water to the hands bending over the heavy stalks. His steps were quiet, careful, and deliberate. He did not rush, but he did not lag. His gaze swept from one edge of the field to another, noting every shadow, every ripple in the mud, every shift in the patterns of footsteps. He noticed which of the overseer's men lingered in the shade, and which walked swiftly through the sun. He noticed the pauses in the ringing of the bell, the subtle differences in its tone at dawn versus dusk. Observation, he understood, was a kind of speech all its own. In silence, He could hear more than those who shouted or laughed. He could hear the rhythm of power and the rhythm of fear alike. The children who mocked him made patterns easy to recognize, who dared push too far, who feared punishment, who followed their friends without question. The overseer, for all his authority, had habits. His steps, his gestures, even the way he adjusted his coat before giving a command, all repeated with perfect predictability. The boy learned them. At mealtimes, he noticed seating arrangements. Who ate closest to the overseer's table? Who slipped scraps to others? Who waited silently for their chance to be fed? Even the whispered complaints of the older enslaved workers did not escape him. He never joined in. He never responded. But he cataloged it all, storing it in a memory that was sharper than anyone would have guessed. The river itself became part of his study. He learned its tides, the patterns of its waves, the times when the boatman would pass close enough to hear the hum of the wind through the canes. He watched how the plantation's dogs reacted to certain noises and how the gates were opened or left unlocked at unusual hours. It was as if he was mapping the entire estate in his mind, piece by piece, sound by sound, step by step. At night, while others slept, he would lie on his pallet and replay the day in his head. He thought of every voice, every gesture, every look that had passed in front of him. The boy noted the smallest details. The bend of a man's finger when he reached for a ledger, the way a woman's eyes darted when she feared the overseer, the precise moment a horse stamped its hoof and when a bell would ring again. Each observation was a thread, and each thread was tied to the next. In his quiet endurance, he was building a map of everything that mattered. It was in these quiet hours that the boy's intelligence became most apparent. While others assumed silence meant ignorance, he was learning strategy and patience. He learned which acts of rebellion were punished harshly and which passed unnoticed. He learned that some men only watched for the obvious mistakes, missing the subtler ones. And he learned that patience could be more powerful than speed, that listening could be more revealing than speaking. He began to see the cracks in the plantation's order. A gate left slightly ajar, a path in the cane that led to the river, a stack of supplies that was poorly guarded. These were not moments of opportunity yet, but he filed them away in his mind, aware that one day, knowledge would be more useful than brute strength. Observation was a quiet kind of survival, and he was learning it faster than anyone suspected. Even the smallest human interactions fascinated him. He watched how the overseer's men looked at each other when they believed no one else was watching. He noted the ways the enslaved women whispered among themselves, sharing information without drawing attention. He saw who protected whom, who feared whom, and who remained indifferent to all. Each detail added to a picture of the plantation's true order, a map of authority, fear, and hidden alliances. By now, some of the older workers were beginning to notice the boy in a new light. Not as simple or empty, but as keen and perceptive. The whispers in the quarters shifted. "That boy sees too much," some said. Others shook their heads, laughing softly. "He don't speak, so he don't know nothing." But those who had eyes to see began to recognize that knowledge was being gathered quietly, in ways that could one day have consequences none of them expected. Observation, the boy realized, required patience, and he had it in abundance. Every day the same routines repeated: the bell, the work, the laughter, the scolding. Every night, the same silence and the same counting of patterns. The overseer believed he was shaping the boy through mockery. The children believed they had exhausted him through ridicule. And yet the boy grew stronger not through confrontation, but through understanding. By the end of the third week, The boy had learned the essential truth of life on the plantation. Those who appear weakest are often the most observant, and those who underestimate them will be surprised in ways they cannot foresee. Silence, patience, and keen observation had become his shield. The boy knew that power often spoke in gestures and habits, in pauses and omissions, not in loud words. And if he could remember everything, wait, and move carefully, the day might come when those around him would learn that the quiet boy had been far from powerless all along. In that quiet endurance, the boy had begun to understand himself, and, unknowingly, the plantation itself. He was small, young, and unseen in their eyes, yet in truth, every laugh thrown at him, every order barked, every glance dismissed, had only trained him to watch, to learn, and to wait. And as he lay on his pallet at night, listening to the soft sigh of the Mississippi against its banks, he understood another truth as well. The world underestimates those who do not speak. And in that underestimation, there is opportunity. The boy's silence had become part of the plantation's daily rhythm, but it also created a new kind of unease. Most enslaved children who faltered were disciplined quickly, loudly, and publicly. Whippings were administered to enforce obedience, scolding, ridicule, or removal of privileges were routine. Yet the boy, known to all as mute, seemed to occupy a space between punishment and immunity. He was disciplined, in a manner of speaking, but not in the ways anyone expected. The overseer observed him closely, though he could not understand what he saw. The boy did not respond with fear, flinch at orders, or rush through tasks out of anxiety. He moved deliberately, carrying water and sweeping the narrow paths between the cane with careful efficiency. Occasionally, the overseer would bark a command, expecting a pause, a question, or even a fumbled mistake to justify a punishment. There was none. The boy simply followed the order, as if he had anticipated it from the start. The unusual discipline became apparent when other children, those who mocked him daily, were corrected for the slightest lapse in obedience. They were scolded, shoved, or whipped for spilling water, for laughing too loudly, for daring to argue over a chore. The boy, however, was never reprimanded in these ways. Not because he was spared, but because he had learned, quickly and quietly, the subtle rules of attention. He noticed the moments when punishment was most likely. The overseer's hand would twitch before a shout, a belt would sway ever so slightly as a warning, eyes would narrow and linger on the offender a moment too long. The boy memorized the exact angles of these gestures. He learned to move when the overseer's gaze was elsewhere, to finish tasks while the men who punished looked past him, distracted by louder voices or more obvious failures. Punishment was not the absence of discipline, but the presence of calculation. The boy discovered that routine mistakes, the ones everyone else made, were punished not because they were wrong, but because they drew attention. Errors that were invisible or inconspicuous went unnoticed. The boy became careful in every detail, mindful of shadows, posture, and timing. In essence, he learned a type of discipline that no one could impose: self-control. The other enslaved children could not understand it. They continued their antics, hiding tools, whispering behind his back, mocking his silence, only to find that Mute remained unaffected. He did not rise to anger, nor did he shrink from ridicule. Instead, he learned. Every prank, every whispered joke, every glance of scorn was stored and examined. One afternoon, a group of children deliberately knocked over a bucket of water beside him. Most boys would have splashed back, cursed, or reacted with tears or anger. Not Mute. He bent down carefully, picking up the bucket and replacing it without spilling a single drop. Then he moved on. No glance at them. No gesture of resentment. The children, frustrated that they could provoke no response, slowly dispersed, muttering that he was strange, too cold to feel. The overseer noticed, though he could not articulate why it unsettled him. Most children reacted to discipline with noise, crying, shouting, groaning, or pleading. That noise allowed the overseer to maintain control, to measure obedience. Mute silence, combined with his careful observation, made him unknowable. No punishment seemed to pierce him. No scolding elicited fear. And in that, there was a peculiar kind of power. Even small acts were discipline in disguise. When he misstepped, perhaps knocking over a broom or dropping a bucket, he corrected it himself before anyone else noticed. When chores required precise timing, he anticipated it. The men around him noticed that he rarely needed instruction twice. Unlike others, he internalized expectations without complaint or explanation. He became the example of a child disciplined not by force, but by patience and attention. The unusual discipline extended to social interactions as well. When older enslaved men and women scolded him quietly, sometimes for speaking too soon, sometimes for appearing inattentive, he absorbed their guidance without argument. He learned which words carried caution, which gestures implied urgency, and which admonitions were empty of real threat. By the time he reached his pallet at night, he had cataloged everything, storing it carefully in memory. Every glance, every whispered warning, every unspoken rule was recorded. This methodical attention granted him a resilience that others lacked. Children who were corrected loudly often rebelled later, out of anger or shame. Those punished for imagined mistakes became fearful, hesitant, or desperate. Mute, however, moved among these patterns like a silent observer, neither drawn into their panic nor trapped by their mistakes. He had discovered a discipline that was self-imposed, unshakable, and invisible to those around him. Over time, some of the older enslaved workers began to notice it. They whispered to each other in the evenings, noting how the boy never stumbled under pressure, never responded with fear, and rarely drew attention to himself. They could not explain it fully, but they recognized that he was learning something important. The world could be endured through patience, observation, and self-control. The overseer, for all his authority, grew uneasy. He could punish loudness, but he could not punish quiet. He could strike those who protested, but he could not strike compliance that was flawless. Mute's discipline was invisible, yet undeniable. He was present at every step, yet resistant to the usual tools of control. And in that resistance, he became something that no one could name. An enigma, a shadow, a silent witness to everything. By the fourth week, it was clear Mute's discipline had transformed him. Where others faltered under the weight of punishment, he endured. Where others reacted, he measured. Where others feared, he watched. And in this careful observation and quiet resilience, he was learning something far beyond the grasp of those who mocked him. That discipline, when chosen rather than imposed, could become a quiet kind of power, waiting for the moment it would be needed most. By the fifth week on the plantation, it had become clear that the boy, known simply as Mute, was not like the others. He did not speak, he did not flinch, and he did not react to mockery. But his mind was quietly active, observing, learning, and calculating. In the small world of the plantation, even the slightest act of intelligence could shift the balance between punishment and freedom, notice and invisibility, survival and peril. It began on a humid afternoon, when the overseer was distracted by the arrival of a riverboat carrying supplies. The overseer's attention was focused on the men unloading sacks of sugar, while the clerks counted ledgers and recorded inventory. The plantation itself hummed with activity workers bending over cane fields, children carrying water, women sweeping the yards, men repairing fences. In that chaos, a single sheet from the overseer's ledger, a record of payments, debts, and inventories, was misplaced. Most would have panicked. A missing page in the overseer's ledger could bring suspicion and punishment. A child might cry or beg. Someone might lie. Someone might quietly accuse another. But Mute did not panic. He had already been watching. He noticed the ledger slip, the way the paper fluttered from the desk, before landing unseen beneath a pile of empty sacks. No one else had seen it, and the overseer continued his counting, unaware that a small but significant mistake had been made. That night, after the men had gone and the children were asleep, Mute returned to the area where the ledger had fallen. His movements were silent, measured, almost imperceptible in the moonlight spilling across the yard. He retrieved the sheet and, with patience and care, returned it to its proper place beneath the overseer's door. It was a small act, and yet it required intelligence, timing, and courage. If he had been caught moving near the overseer's office after hours, the consequences would have been severe. The next morning, the ledger was found intact. The overseer assumed it had been mislaid by one of the clerks or simply never gone missing at all. No one suspected Mute. Yet in that single action, the boy had demonstrated a subtle mastery of the plantation's rhythms, the precise movements of men, the timing of events, the invisibility that silence could grant. Even among the enslaved workers, word of the boy's quiet capabilities began to spread. The older men and women, who had watched him for weeks, recognized that he was not merely enduring life on the plantation, but actively shaping it in unseen ways. One woman, who had lost much to punishment and misfortune in her own life, whispered to another, "That boy, he watches everything. He knows more than we think." Mute's intelligence was never loud or boastful. He did not seek recognition, and he never claimed credit, but every act was deliberate. He understood that patience and observation could be as powerful as physical strength. Where others rushed and stumbled, he waited. Where others reacted, he calculated. And where others relied on words to assert themselves, he relied on his mind, which worked quietly, steadily, and without error. It was not only the ledger that revealed his abilities. In the fields, he learned which stalks of cane were easiest to cut, which rows were already weakened by sun or water, and which tools could break if used carelessly. He adapted to the rhythm of each worker, walking beside them without drawing notice, mimicking movements without error, absorbing knowledge that others wasted on chatter or complaint. The overseer, meanwhile, remained unaware. He assumed that Mute's silence meant dullness, that his calm demeanor meant weakness, that his obedience meant fear. But intelligence, as the boy understood, was invisible to those who expected it to be loud or brash. Knowledge gathered quietly could move mountains, or, in his case, preserve life in ways no one would ever suspect. Even the mocking children began to notice, though they could not name it. The boy never failed in any task, never stumbled in carrying water, never spilled food, never misaligned a tool. They began to realize that their jokes fell flat, their tricks ineffective, because he anticipated the outcome without a word. The realization unsettled them. They had assumed he was powerless. They were discovering that silence could conceal something far more potent: awareness and foresight. That night, as Mute lay on his pallet in the crowded quarters, he replayed the day's events in his mind. Every glance, every gesture, every pattern of movement was catalogued. The ledger, the children's tricks, the overseer's distracted moments, all were connected in his mind like threads of a web. And as he traced these threads, he began to understand a truth that would guide him in the days to come. Intelligence applied quietly can alter the course of life itself without ever revealing its presence. The small act of returning the ledger may have seemed insignificant to anyone watching. But in the boy's mind, it was proof of a larger principle, that patience, observation, and silent action could preserve safety, earn trust, and lay the groundwork for something greater. Every act of intelligence built upon the previous one, a silent accumulation of skill and awareness. Each small success reinforced his understanding of the plantation's rhythm, its weaknesses, and its predictable patterns. By the time the overseer called the roll that morning, everything seemed as it had always been. The ledger was complete. The children had laughed, the men had worked, and the women had whispered in the quarters. No one suspected that Mute had been at the center of this quiet victory, carefully ensuring the plantation's order remained intact. And yet, in that moment, he had demonstrated something that would mark the turning point in how he was perceived. Not by mocking children, not by the overseer, but by those few who observed quietly and who would one day understand that the boy's intelligence was as sharp and unyielding as the cane. Cutting knives in the field. In the world of the plantation, where survival often depended on brute force, loud protest, or obedience, the boy had learned a different method. Quiet intelligence applied at the right moment, when no one is watching, can change everything. And it was in these small, invisible acts that Mute began to prepare for the moment when silence and intelligence would become his greatest allies. By now, Mute's silence was no longer a simple curiosity. It was a force that shaped how those around him behaved. Yet, while most regarded him as empty-headed or harmless, there were those among the older enslaved who began to notice the quiet intelligence behind his still eyes. Among them was Eleanor, a woman in her 50s, whose hands had been hardened by decades of labor, and whose heart had carried the weight of losses too numerous to count. She watched the boy more closely than most, sensing that beneath the calm exterior lay a mind alive with understanding. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the cane, Eleanor approached the boy quietly in the corner of the quarters. The plantation was settling into its nightly rhythm, men returning from work, children dozing near the fire, the overseer's men calling orders from the far yard. Her voice was low, measured, almost a whisper, as if the very walls had ears. "Child," she said, "they are watching you more than you think." Mute did not respond as always, but his eyes lifted briefly, meeting hers. In that instant, she recognized that he understood perfectly. No words were necessary. "They think your silence is weakness," she continued, "but it ain't. You see things they miss. You hear things they don't want noticed. Keep that in mind." Again, Mute remained silent, yet he nodded slightly. That single motion, almost imperceptible, conveyed his acknowledgement. Eleanor leaned closer, lowering her voice further. "Tomorrow, when the overseer sends the men to check the sugar vats, be careful. They'll count barrels, check ledgers, and watch for mistakes that aren't there. Some of them, they want to catch a slip so they can punish someone else. Remember, watch and wait. Don't let them see what you notice." Her words were not just advice, they were a warning. In the quarters, Mute had seen the patterns of power, and now Eleanor confirmed them. Her whisper was the confirmation of what he had already observed, that vigilance was more valuable than obedience, and patience was more powerful than reaction. That night, as the plantation settled into silence, the boy replayed Eleanor's warning in his mind. He thought not just of the overseer and his men, but of the children who mocked him, the women who whispered among themselves, and the patterns of every single task he had been assigned. The warning was not a moment of fear. It was an opportunity to practice what he had learned in secret over the previous weeks. The next day arrived humid and still. Mist hovered over the fields, and the bell rang long and hard, signaling the start of work. The overseer barked orders as the men checked the sugar vats. Mute moved quietly among them, noting the precise way the overseer's hand rested on the ledgers, how his eyes lingered on certain barrels, and how the assistants shifted when they feared correction. Every glance, every step, every whisper was cataloged in the boy's mind. At one point, a clerk almost tripped over a misplaced board near the vat. Others would have shouted, scolded, or punished the boy if he had stumbled similarly. But Mute had anticipated the uneven plank. He stepped lightly, placing his feet where the board would bear his weight evenly. Avoiding both notice and danger, he had turned Eleanor's whispered warning into action, navigating the day with a careful, almost imperceptible precision. By noon, the overseer had completed his rounds. The men counted barrels, checked ledgers, and made notes. No one caught mistakes because none existed where the boy had walked. Yet those who had observed him, Eleanor, some older men, and a few women, recognized that Mute's presence had prevented small accidents from escalating. His intelligence, combined with his patience and observation, had quietly stabilized the plantation's routine. That evening, Eleanor spoke to him again. "See, you keep your head and you survive. You watch, you learn, and you move. That's the way." Mute nodded, a slight movement, almost invisible in the dim light. It was a gesture of understanding, acknowledgement, and perhaps gratitude. He had learned not only to endure the daily routines and mockery, but also to interpret subtle warnings, to act without calling attention to himself, and to apply intelligence where it mattered most. The whispered warning carried more than instruction. It carried trust. Eleanor's words were not just guidance. They were recognition that Mute's silence was not ignorance, but awareness. The warning also taught him something that no lesson in mockery or discipline could. Alliances mattered. Even on a plantation where fear ruled, there were those who could see, who could act, and who could provide small glimpses of protection. These alliances were subtle, fragile, and easily overlooked, but they were essential. That night, lying on his pallet, Mute reflected on Eleanor's guidance. He understood the weight of the warning and the significance of discretion. Every gesture, every glance, every step could carry meaning beyond the surface. And while the overseer believed his control absolute, and the children believed his silence dull, the boy realized that intelligence applied carefully could bend the rules of observation itself. He had learned patience, endurance, and the power of silent observation. Now, he had learned the power of listening to those who truly understood him, even if only in whispers. In that moment, Mute became something more than a silent child. He became a strategist. Every warning, every subtle piece of knowledge, every observation of human behavior became part of a plan he had not yet fully revealed to the world. And in this small but profound understanding, he prepared himself for the moments when silence and intelligence would be tested in ways the plantation could never anticipate. The night the storm arrived, the plantation seemed to hold its breath. It was late September of 1847, and the Mississippi winds, swollen with summer rains, began to push against the cane fields with relentless force. The sky darkened early, clouds gathering like a wall across the horizon, and even the animals seemed to sense the coming tempest. The overseer had barked orders all afternoon, warning the workers to secure tools, tether animals, and double-check the gates. But Mute, as always, observed quietly, noticing what others ignored. He watched the men in the fields, hurriedly stacking barrels and piling supplies against the wind. Their voices, usually sharp with command or complaint, were raised now in a mixture of urgency and irritation. The children, who earlier had mocked him, clung to each other in fear, their pranks forgotten in the face of nature's looming power. The older enslaved women moved silently, checking corners and securing windows, muttering prayers under their breath. Mute noticed every movement, the subtle shifts of a board as it strained against the wind, the way the overseer's hand lingered on the ledger as if gripping it for protection, the flickering shadows cast by lanterns swaying in the gusts. But most importantly, he noticed the gaps in preparation. The gates that could not close properly, the roof shingles already loosening, the back door that tended to creak loudly under pressure. These were small details, almost invisible to others preoccupied with their own tasks, but Mute cataloged them meticulously. As dusk fell, the wind rose to a roar, bending the cane like a sea of green waves. Rain began in soft drops, then quickened to a steady drum against the plantation's roof. Lanterns flickered and guttered, shadows dancing unnaturally across the yard. The overseer's voice, once commanding, now carried an edge of panic. "Secure the gates," he shouted. "Check the stock. Move faster." "Damn you!" The enslaved workers moved with a practiced efficiency, but fatigue and fear were visible on every face. The children clung to the quarters, shivering, while the men wrestled with barrels that slipped and toppled under the relentless wind. Mute, carrying a small bucket of water, walked calmly through the chaos. He paused only briefly, noting how the wind bent a tree over the back path, how the smaller boys struggled with the heavy barrels, and how the dogs, uneasy, barked at nothing in particular. He noticed the overlooked gaps in the fences, the weak boards along the riverbank, and the exact moment a lantern swayed enough to threaten to fall. Then came a subtle shift, a whisper of a sound that might have been imagined. The overseer, distracted by shouting, did not hear it, neither did the men. But Mute did. A small latch, worn by time and rain, had loosened on the gate that led to the river's edge. It rattled softly, and if left unattended, it would swing open entirely under the storm's force. The boy acted. Quietly, carefully, he moved to the latch, pressing it into place. The wind tugged at his small frame, but he held firm. The gate, once secured, would not give way to the storm. He did not call attention to himself. He did not seek praise. He simply acted, using observation, patience, and intelligence to prevent disaster that might have gone unnoticed until it was too late. Meanwhile, the overseer, unaware of the small but crucial correction, continued his rounds, scolding, commanding, and gesturing. He never saw the boy's intervention, and that was precisely the point. Mute's discipline, patience, and foresight had ensured safety without notice. By midnight, the storm had grown in intensity. Rain fell in torrents, hammering the tin roofs and muddying the fields. Lightning split the sky, followed by rolls of thunder that shook the plantation, as though nature itself demanded obedience. The enslaved workers huddled in the quarters, whispering prayers, recounting their day, comforting frightened children. Mute lay on his pallet, listening to every sound. The creak of the beams, the whistle of wind through cracks, the rush of water toward the river. It was then that he noticed something extraordinary, patterns that others failed to see. The river, swollen from upstream rains, began to edge closer to the lower fields. A low-lying path that was usually dry now carried a thin but fast current. A barrel, left unsecured earlier in the day, teetered dangerously close to a fence that could not withstand the pressure. Most would have panicked. Most did not possess the patience to calculate risk in the midst of fear. But Mute, with weeks of careful observation behind him, understood. He rose silently, moved to secure the barrel, adjusted the fence post, and noted the path to the river. Each action was deliberate, each movement was calculated, and each time he avoided the gaze of overseers, children, and men distracted by the storm. By the time dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving the plantation battered but intact. The overseer, checking his property, noticed no missing barrels, no flooded paths, no damaged gates. No one suspected the boy had been at the center of preserving the estate. To the overseer, it appeared that fortune or chance had spared the plantation. To those who knew Mute best, it was clear intelligence, patience, and careful observation had saved the day. That stormy night became a turning point in subtle ways. The boy realized that his silence was not weakness, it was power. He understood that careful observation, combined with timely action, could bend the course of events without revealing his hand. Eleanor, watching from the corner of the quarters, saw the boy move through the chaos and whispered quietly to another woman, "See him, that one. He ain't just surviving. He's learning the rhythm of this place." And Mute, lying once more on his pallet, as the first light of morning crept across the fields, reflected on what the storm had taught him. That strength need not be loud, courage need not be visible, and intelligence applied quietly could alter outcomes in ways no one would suspect. The plantation believed it had endured the storm by chance, but Mute knew better. In the heart of chaos, his silent mind had guided action, preserved safety, and marked the beginning of something greater, an unseen mastery of the world around him. That night, and the lessons it carried, would not soon be forgotten by him, and soon enough, the plantation itself would face the consequences of underestimating the boy who never spoke. The morning after the storm was heavy with an eerie quiet. The plantation had survived, battered but intact. Yet an invisible tension hung in the air. Workers moved slowly, their bodies aching from the night's labor, and their nerves frayed from the wind and rain. The overseer paced the yard, inspecting the damage, barking orders to secure loose boards and check fences. No one noticed the first anomaly, until the breakfast bell rang, and the call for the enslaved children revealed something that would send a ripple of fear through the quarters. Mute's cot was empty. For weeks, he had lain in that small corner of the quarters, quiet and observant, a child who spoke little but saw everything. The children who mocked him, the men who ignored him, even the overseer, had come to expect him in his place, silent yet present, a fixture of the plantation's rhythm. Now, that fixture was gone. The first to notice were the younger children. They called out softly, peering into the empty space. "Mute," one whispered. "Where is he?" No answer came. An older man, bent and gray, leaned forward to inspect the cot. "He ain't here," he muttered, frowning. "Was he up before dawn?" No one could say. The whispers spread quickly. The overseer, returning from inspecting a corner of the sugar vats, noticed the stir. "What is this?" he demanded. "Where is that boy?" The room fell silent. Children shuffled their feet. Adults exchanged uneasy glances. Some had caught brief glimpses of him moving about early that morning, but none had followed closely enough to know where he had gone. The overseer's voice rose sharply. "Search the quarters, every corner." The men obeyed, pulling aside bedding, inspecting the shadows, tapping on floorboards. The wind from the night before had left puddles along the wooden planks, yet no sign of the boy remained. The overseer, frowning and irritated, ordered a search of the surrounding fields. Dogs were released to track scent, though the heavy rain had washed away most traces. Still, the boy's small footprints were nowhere to be found. The children who had mocked him days before now whispered in hushed fear, "Maybe he left." One said, "Maybe he ran away." But the older enslaved workers shook their heads. "No," said Eleanor, stepping forward quietly. Her eyes, sharp and observant as always, scanned the yard and the riverbank. "He ain't just run. That boy, he watches too closely to leave in haste. He's gone when he chose to be gone. Her words, meant to calm, had the opposite effect on the overseer. He could not understand it. A silent child, never challenging or outspoken, could not wield power. And yet, he was gone, disappearing under the watch of dozens who had seen nearly everything. The absence itself was unsettling, a gap where presence had always been assured. As the day wore on, the search expanded. Men checked the riverbank, the barns, the sugar fields, even the dense cane at the far edge of the property. Every path Mute might have taken was considered. Every gate and fence was inspected. And yet, he remained absent. It was as though he had dissolved into the landscape itself, leaving behind only the memory of his quiet vigilance. The children began to whisper again, this time in awe rather than mockery. Do you think he could just disappear? One asked, trembling. Maybe he saw a way. Another replied, maybe he learned too much. Eleanor remained silent, her face calm but her eyes thoughtful. She knew that Mute had been more than quiet. He had been patient, observant, and intelligent beyond his years. And now, all those traits that had seemed to render him harmless had enabled his disappearance. By afternoon, even the overseer began to feel an unease that bordered on fear. His orders had been precise, his men diligent, yet one small, silent child had evaded every measure. The thought gnawed at him, how could someone so small, so quiet, so unassuming, slip from his control? The enslaved workers, meanwhile, processed the event in their own ways. Some felt relief, knowing that the boy who had endured mockery and cruelty might now be free, even if only temporarily. Others felt a pang of loss, for in Mute's absence they saw a void, the disappearance of a mind they had come to respect quietly. Eleanor alone seemed to comprehend the full magnitude. The boy had acted on all he had learned, using observation, intelligence, and patience to craft a moment of liberation. That night, the plantation was quieter than usual. Children huddled close to one another, whispering tales of the boy's cunning, embellishing his intelligence with every retelling. Adults spoke in hushed tones, some afraid of the overseer, some afraid of what the absence of the boy suggested, that even the smallest, quietest, most overlooked among them could possess an understanding that surpassed even the strongest or loudest. And somewhere beyond the plantation, along paths known only to the boy, perhaps near the river's swollen banks, or the dense cane where the storm had left the ground soft and malleable, Mute moved deliberately. Every step was calculated, every decision informed by weeks of careful observation. He did not run blindly. He did not flee in fear. He moved in silence, guided by intelligence, patience, and the quiet endurance that had sustained him from the day he first arrived without a name. The overseer, meanwhile, would continue his inspections for days, weeks even, never imagining that the child he had dismissed as empty-headed had orchestrated his own disappearance. To him, it would remain a mystery, a gap in the plantation's order that could not be explained. Yet, for those who understood Mute, his empty cot was not simply the absence of a child. It was proof of something far more remarkable, that silence, observation, patience, and intelligence could outlast cruelty and control, leaving the world unprepared for the consequences. And in that quiet proof, the boy's story, at once ordinary and extraordinary, became legend among those who knew him, whispered in the corners of the quarters long after his disappearance was discovered. The empty cot was the first sign that the boy's endurance and intelligence were not merely survival. They were a quiet rebellion. And the plantation, with all its authority, all its rules, and all its cruelty, would never see the full measure of the power that had slipped through its fingers silently, deliberately, and without a word. By the third day after Mute's disappearance, the plantation was thick with whispers. The overseer, normally a man of impatience and certainty, found himself unsettled by the boy's absence. Every creak in the floorboards, every shift of shadows across the cane fields, every stray breeze through the shutters seemed amplified, as though the plantation itself had noticed the empty cot. The children were the first to circulate stories, some fearful, some awe-filled. He knew where the gates would open. One whispered to a younger cousin. He could slip past the dogs like a shadow. Another added, eyes wide with wonder. They told of his intelligence, as though it had been visible all along, as though the boy's silence had been a mask concealing a mind far too clever for their understanding. The older enslaved workers, those who had observed him carefully, reflected on the weeks of patience and quiet endurance that had defined his presence. Eleanor, still seated on her pallet near the corner of the quarters, spoke softly to a few who had noticed his intelligence long before anyone else. He was patient, she said, her voice barely audible. He watched more than we did. He learned the rhythm of the overseer, the rhythm of the children, the rhythm of the wind, and he used it. Her words carried weight. They were not meant for gossip, but for understanding. The older workers nodded in solemn agreement, recalling incidents that had seemed small or accidental at the time. The ledger returned before anyone noticed. The barrels stabilized during the storm, the gates secured before the river threatened to overflow. These acts, once unnoticed, were now seen as deliberate, quiet displays of intelligence and foresight. Even among those who had once mocked him, there was a new reverence. The children who had thrown water at him, tripped him, and whispered insults were now reluctant to speak his name. It was no longer mockery. The silence they once exploited had become a symbol of power. A whispered rumor traveled from child to child. He wasn't just quiet. He was planning. He knew what he was doing. Fear mingled with awe, as the smallest among them came to understand that the boy they had ridiculed was far from powerless. The overseer, however, saw none of this reverence. To him, the boy's disappearance was a problem to solve, a gap in authority that demanded correction. He ordered searches beyond the usual boundaries of the plantation, instructing men to check along the riverbank, the cane fields, and even neighboring plots where the enslaved sometimes sought shelter. Yet each search returned empty-handed. The overseer, frustrated and increasingly uneasy, began to suspect the impossible, that the boy had vanished without trace, moving silently and deliberately beyond his reach. The whispers of the adults, meanwhile, grew bolder, though always careful. They spoke of Mute as if he were a figure larger than life, one who had mastered patience, observation, and intelligence in ways no overseer could control. They speculated on his knowledge of the land, the timing of events, and his uncanny ability to predict human behavior. The more they spoke, the more the legend of the boy solidified, moving beyond the bounds of reality into something almost mythic. In quiet moments, Eleanor reflected on what had truly happened. The boy had disappeared not in fear, not in haste, but with purpose. He had waited, observed, and acted when the moment allowed him to do so safely. His intelligence had guided him through the storm, past gates, across fields, and beyond the boundaries that others assumed were absolute. His silence, once mocked as weakness, had been his shield, his patience, his greatest weapon. The plantation itself seemed to respond to his absence. Tasks that had once been routine felt different, as though the rhythm the boy had silently maintained had shifted. Children moved more cautiously, whispering in corners, aware now that the smallest observer could wield power greater than their understanding. Adults, while keeping their distance from the overseer's suspicion, began to reconsider their own movements and routines, remembering that intelligence and patience often outlasted cruelty and authority. Rumors began to reach neighboring plantations as well. Some spoke of the boy having fled, though no one could explain how a child so small had escaped the vigilance of the overseer and the dogs. Others suggested he had discovered some hidden path along the river, a place no one dared to tread. Each retelling added layers to the story, blending fact with speculation, yet all agreed on one point: Mute had been underestimated, and the consequences of that underestimation were profound. Within the quarters, the reflection on his disappearance became a lesson. Eleanor spoke quietly to the younger children. See what patience can do. See what silence can teach. He watched, he waited, and he moved when he chose. That's how he left without anyone stopping him. Her words, deliberate and thoughtful, carried not only admiration but guidance. They underscored the idea that intelligence, combined with endurance, could shape the world in ways force and anger could not. By the end of the week, the plantation had settled into a new rhythm, one defined by absence as much as by presence. Mute was gone, but the lessons he embodied remained. Observers, mockers, and even the overseer were forced to reckon with the quiet power of intelligence, patience, and careful observation. In whispered stories, in the cautious movements of children, and in the careful calculations of adults, Mute's influence endured. And somewhere, beyond the river and the far fields, the boy moved deliberately, guided by the same quiet intelligence that had carried him through weeks of mockery, discipline, and storms. His disappearance was not escape alone. It was the culmination of everything he had learned. His silent endurance had been a strategy, his patience a shield, and his intelligence a map to a world beyond the reach of those who had dismissed him. The legend of the boy, the one everyone had mocked for his silence, grew with each retelling. Among the children, the enslaved workers, and even in hushed corners near the overseer's ear, his story became a testament to the unseen power of quiet observation, careful action, and intelligence applied with patience. In the absence of the child, the plantation itself was forced to reflect, and in that reflection, the boy's influence lingered, invisible yet undeniable. In the weeks and months following Mute's disappearance, the plantation settled into a new rhythm, though one profoundly altered by the absence of the boy, who had once moved quietly through its halls and fields. The overseer's frustration lingered like a shadow over the yard, a reminder that control, no matter how rigid, could be challenged in ways unseen. The children, who had once mocked Mute, now spoke his name only in whispers, sometimes in fear, sometimes in awe, as if saying it aloud, too loudly, might summon consequences they could neither predict nor understand. Among the older enslaved workers, reflection replaced gossip. They remembered the small details. The ledger returned to its place, the barrels stabilized in the storm, the gates secured without notice. Each act, once unnoticed, now resonated as proof of intelligence, patience, and careful endurance. Eleanor, her hands still worn and scarred from labor, often sat quietly in the evening, gazing toward the river and the edge of the cane fields where the boy had likely passed unseen. She traced his absence as though it were a map, noting the moments he had acted without detection, the paths he must have taken, and the patience it had required to slip from sight entirely. The children learned in silence, too. Those who had mocked him began to move with more care, understanding intuitively that observation could be more powerful than noise, patience more enduring than ridicule. They remembered how Mute had never faltered under scorn, never shouted back when provoked, and never allowed fear to dictate his movements. In his quiet endurance, they found an example neither celebrated nor spoken of openly, yet impossible to ignore. Even the overseer, though unwilling to admit it aloud, grew uneasy in subtle ways. The memory of a silent child who had evaded his gaze and his control haunted his steps. He would glance toward the quarters or the cane fields, expecting to see the boy at some task, only to be reminded of absence. Each day, the ghost of the boy's intelligence seemed to linger in the routine of work, the rhythm of the fields, and the small, overlooked moments where attention and patience mattered most. Word of the disappearance traveled slowly to neighboring plantations, carried by whispers of workers who had noticed the boy's presence, then absence, and who shared it only in careful tones. Some said he had vanished entirely, slipping beyond the river into lands unknown. Others speculated that he had found refuge along hidden paths, in the thickets and swamps, guided by the intelligence and patience that had always defined him. The story became part of the landscape, woven into the memory of the land, the river, and the cane fields, lingering in spaces that were neither fully seen nor fully understood. Those who had known him best, the older men, the women who whispered advice, the children who had once mocked, began to realize that his disappearance had not been an escape in fear, but a demonstration of endurance and understanding. Mute had used the lessons of silence, observation, and patience to move beyond the reach of cruelty. Every act he had committed quietly, the ledger returned, the barrels stabilized, the gates secured, the storm navigated, was part of the preparation that allowed him to vanish. In that absence, his intelligence became tangible, leaving a legacy that was both invisible and undeniable. At night, the quarters were quieter than before. Children huddled near lanterns, speaking of the boy in the low hum of reflection rather than in jest. The adults, in their private moments, recalled his movements, his eyes, the way he had listened without speaking, and the moments he had acted without being seen. Mute silence became a measure of power, a reminder that presence need not be loud to matter, and that observation, patience, and careful thought could endure far beyond the constraints of immediate circumstance. Some began to believe, in hushed tones, that Mute's absence was more than a disappearance. It was a lesson etched into memory, a demonstration that the smallest, quietest, and most overlooked could command influence greater than their size, louder than their voice. The legacy of silence persisted, not as a story to be celebrated aloud, but as a quiet force that shaped behavior, awareness, and understanding across the plantation. Eleanor, often sitting alone near the river at dusk, would remember the way he moved. How his small frame carried weight far beyond his years. How his eyes had taken in the smallest details. How his patience had been unyielding. She traced the memory of him like a shadow along the riverbank, imagining the careful steps he must have taken through cane and field, guided only by observation and a quiet mind that knew exactly when to move and when to wait. The children, older now, sometimes paused in their play or work, glancing at the spaces he once occupied. Even without the boy present, they remembered the power of his quiet endurance. It had been invisible, subtle, yet profound, a force that had reshaped how they understood observation, action, and survival. Mute's legacy was not in words spoken or deeds loudly proclaimed, but in the way his intelligence had quietly changed the rhythm of the plantation, leaving an imprint that could not be erased. Years later, the story of the boy would persist in whispers and glances, in the patterns of movement and care taken by those who remembered him. No one knew where he had gone, and no one could trace his steps fully. Yet the plantation itself carried the memory of his presence, the echo of intelligence applied with patience, and the enduring example of a child who had survived by watching, waiting, and acting with precision. And in that quiet memory, There was a haunting truth: the smallest, the silent, and the overlooked could possess a power beyond reckoning, leaving traces long after absence became reality. In silence, there was survival. In observation, there was strength. And in patience, there was freedom that no cruelty could seize. The empty spaces, the careful glances, and the whispered recollections ensured that Mute was never truly gone, even as the plantation continued its daily rhythms. His legacy, carried in the quiet hearts of those who had known him, endured as a testament to endurance, intelligence, and the haunting power of silence. Disflamer: this story is a work of fiction inspired by historical contexts and is not presented as a verified historical account.